The thunder of artillery was fading, not because the guns had gone silent, but because Hans Bauer's ears had grown numb to the endless roar. Weeks of retreat had turned into days of desperation, and the once proud Wehrmacht soldier now shuffled forward with hundreds of others, his rifle surrendered, his uniform stained with dirt, sweat, and defeat. He was 24 years old, but war had stolen from him the lightness of youth, replacing it with hollow eyes and a stomach that had long since learned to growl in vain. Captured in the spring of 1944, Hans and his fellow prisoners were herded into trucks under the watch of American GIs. Some expected cruelty, even revenge. After all, they had been told, by officers, by propaganda, by whispers in the trenches, that surrendering to the Americans meant humiliation and suffering. But the first surprise came swiftly. The Americans gave them water, real bread, and even cigarettes before the journey began. Hans had not tasted soft bread in months, only the coarse dark loaves that crumbled like sawdust in the mouth. The journey westward was long. For days, Hans saw a landscape that seemed almost alien. Villages untouched by bombing, green fields stretching wide and calm, and the faces of civilians who did not spit at them or curse them. Instead, most simply stared, curious rather than hostile. When the convoy finally reached a coastal port, the captured Germans were herded once more, this time onto a ship. The Atlantic awaited them. Hans could scarcely believe it. America. The word itself carried weight. In the villages back home, America was spoken like a faraway dream, a land of endless machines and strange abundance. German propaganda mocked it as decadent, a place where people grew weak from comfort. Yet now, bound for that very country, Hans could not decide whether to feel dread or a flicker of hope. The voyage was long, rough, and suffocating. The prisoners were packed tightly in the holds, sleeping shoulder to shoulder on bunks that smelled of sweat and sea. Some grew seasick, others whispered of home, but most stayed silent, trying to imagine what awaited them on the other side. At night, Hans stared at the dark steel ceiling and wondered about his family. His father's farm in Bavaria. Was it still standing? Was his mother alive? Would his younger brother, who had been drafted only months earlier, survive this brutal war? When land finally rose on the horizon, it seemed unreal. America looked wide and endless, its harbors buzzing with cranes, ships, and men working tirelessly. The prisoners were offloaded, processed, and loaded onto trains. Guards were present, but their demeanor was different. Strict, yes, but not cruel. Hans noticed one guard handing candy to a group of local children at the station. Could such small kindness exist in the land of the enemy? The train rattled for hours, perhaps days, across a countryside that stunned Hans. Fields that stretched beyond the horizon, towns with neat houses and white fences, roads bustling with cars. More cars than Hans had ever seen in his life. Even through the barbed wire-covered train windows, he could see a world that looked untouched by war. No craters, no rubble, no smoldering ruins. It was as if the war belonged to another planet. When they finally arrived at the prison camp in WWII, the Midwest, Hans braced himself. He had expected cold barracks, harsh labor, and meager food. Instead, he found wooden barracks that, though plain, were solid and clean. Each man was given a bunk with a mattress and blankets. There were showers, real showers, with hot water that poured over his shoulders and washed months of grime from his skin. For the first time in years, Hans felt truly clean. The meals were astonishing, plates of meat, potatoes, bread, and even butter. Coffee that smelled rich and strong. Soup that had flavor rather than thin, watery broth. Some of the men whispered in disbelief. Others simply devoured what they were given as though it might vanish. For Hans, each bite carried not just nourishment, but confusion. This was the enemy? This was captivity? That night, lying on his bunk in the warm barracks, Hans could not sleep. He had been taught to expect cruelty from America, and yet here he was, with a full belly, warm blankets, and no threats hanging over him. Around him, the other prisoners muttered in low voices, their words filled with wonder, suspicion, and even guilt. The war raged on back home, where families starved, bombs fell, and soldiers died daily. Yet here, in the heart of enemy land, the prisoners of war were being treated with a dignity they had not anticipated. Hans turned over, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know what to make of it, but deep inside, he knew one thing. This was only the beginning. More surprises awaited, and they would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world. The morning sun cast long shadows over the flat plains as the train screeched to a halt. A whistle blew, boots stomped, and the heavy doors of the rail cars slid open with a metallic groan. Hans blinked into the brightness. Before him stretched rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers standing tall at each corner. Soldiers with rifles stood nearby, but their expressions were not those of executioners, more like weary workers carrying out a routine. The prisoners were lined up, counted, and led through the gates. Hans studied the camp with cautious eyes. He expected misery, yet what he saw was order. The barracks were plain but well built. Gravel paths connected the rows, and beyond the fences he could see fields, small roads, even distant farmhouses. It didn't look like a place of torment. It looked more like a small village trapped inside fences. As the men entered, they were handed supplies. Soap, towels, and clothing marked PW in bold black letters. Hans was stunned by the practicality. The clothes were clean, the shoes sturdy. After years of rationing and shortages back home, even these simple items felt like luxuries. Inside the barracks, sunlight poured through windows onto rows of bunks. Each man had his own space, his own mattress stuffed with cotton, not straw. Blankets folded neatly at the end of each bed. The air smelled faintly of wood, not rot or mold. The sight alone caused murmurs among the prisoners. Some muttered that it must be a trick. Others swore the Americans had prepared this only because Red Cross inspectors might come. But then came the real shock. The mess hall. The prisoners shuffled into a large hall lined with long wooden tables. Trays clattered as steaming food was ladled onto them. Meatloaf, potatoes with gravy, green beans, soft bread with butter. Even dessert, a square of cake, topped with a thin glaze of chocolate. Hans stared at his tray in disbelief. In Germany, even civilians barely tasted meat anymore, let alone cake. Soldiers at the front survived on thin soup, hard bread, and whatever they could scavenge. Yet here, in captivity, he was given more food than he had seen in months. The first bite nearly brought tears to his eyes. Warm, savory, filling. He devoured it like a starving man, because he was one. Around him, men murmured, laughed nervously, and shoveled food into their mouths. Some even joked in broken English to the guards, who answered with shrugs or smirks, but no cruelty. When Hans finished, he leaned back and stared at the ceiling of the mess hall. For the first time in years, his stomach was full, but fullness brought confusion. Wasn't the enemy supposed to starve them, to punish them for the destruction Germany had caused? Instead, the Americans were feeding them better than their own army ever had. The days that followed revealed even more. The prisoners were assigned light work, tending gardens, repairing fences, helping in the kitchens. For this, they earned small allowances that could be spent in the camp canteen. Hans laughed the first time he saw it. Shelves stocked with cigarettes, candy, and small luxuries. And then, there it was. Rows of glass bottles filled with a dark, fizzy drink. Coca-Cola. He had heard the name before, whispered by soldiers who had fought in North Africa or France, but he had never seen it, let alone tasted it. The first sip stung his tongue with sharp bubbles, a sweetness so foreign that he coughed in surprise. His comrades laughed, but soon they too were hooked, sipping from the cold bottles like children discovering candy. It was unlike anything they had known, refreshing, frivolous, and oddly comforting. And then came ice cream. It was on a hot summer afternoon when the canteen served scoops of pale vanilla in small cups. Hans held the spoon like a relic, staring at the melting cream. The first taste was cold, rich, sweet beyond imagination. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he wasn't a prisoner, wasn't a soldier. wasn't a man haunted by war. He was just a boy again, sitting under a tree at his father's farm, free and innocent. The camp buzzed with astonishment. Men who had trudged through mud, watched comrades die, and seen cities crumble, were now arguing over which flavor was better, vanilla or chocolate. Some said this was proof the Americans were decadent, soft, unfit for true struggle. But others, like Hans, felt something deeper. If even prisoners were treated with such humanity, then what kind of land was this? At night, Hans lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling again. He thought of the propaganda posters back home, depictions of America as a land of chaos, crime, and corruption. Yet here he had seen order, kindness, even abundance. The contradiction gnawed at him. If everything he had been taught about the enemy was false, then what else had been a lie? The war still raged far away, but within the fences of the camp, another battle was taking place. A quiet war inside the minds of men who could not reconcile what they had expected with what they were living. For Hans, that confusion grew each day, sharpened with every sip of Coca-Cola and every spoonful of ice cream, and though he could not yet admit it, he had begun to wonder if perhaps captivity had given him something he had not known in years, a glimpse of humanity, even hope. The first time Hans held the cold glass bottle of Coca-Cola in his hands, he felt as if he were clutching something forbidden, something not meant for a man like him. The bottle hissed when the cap was pried off, releasing a sharp fizz that tickled his nose. He had smelled beer before, he had known the earthy aroma of rye bread and cabbage soup, but this scent, sweet, sparkling, alive, was entirely foreign. He lifted it to his lips with hesitation, as though it might burn, and then the liquid rushed into his mouth, dancing on his tongue with bubbles and sugar. Hans coughed from the surprise of it, and the men around him burst into laughter. "Too strong for you, Bauer?" one of them teased. But then they too took their first sips, and soon the barracks were filled with the same chorus, coughs, exclamations, and wide-eyed amazement. The drink was unlike anything they had ever known. It was not beer, not water, not fruit juice, but something strange and exhilarating. Some called it childish, others decadent, but no one could deny that they wanted more. Days later came the ice cream. It was a blistering July afternoon when the canteen announced it would be serving a special treat. The prisoners lined up with skepticism. Surely it was just another rumor, another trick. But when Hans finally reached the counter, he was handed a small cup filled with a pale, smooth mound. He stared at it, bewildered. Food was supposed to be hot, heavy, sustaining. But this was cold, fragile, almost melting before his eyes. He dipped the spoon in and tasted. At once the coldness shocked his teeth, but then the flavor bloomed, creamy, sweet, delicate in a way no soldier of the Eastern Front could have imagined. Hans froze, spoon still in his mouth, while a rush of memories crashed over him. Summer fields back in Bavaria, his younger brother laughing as they stole apples from a neighbor's tree, his mother humming as she baked bread in the old stone oven. He swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. Around him, men reacted with disbelief and joy. Some laughed, some jeered, some devoured their ice cream so quickly that brain freeze left them groaning. One man, a farmer's son from Saxony, declared it the finest thing he had ever tasted, better than schnapps, better than roast pork. Another scoffed, insisting that no real German would waste time on such frivolities. Yet he too licked his spoon. Clean. Soon, arguments broke out in the barracks, half joking but filled with energy. Was Coca-Cola truly better than German beer? Was vanilla ice cream superior to chocolate? The debate seemed absurd in contrast to the world they had left behind, a.e. world of shells, mud, and blood. Here, their greatest conflict was over flavors. The Americans watched it all with quiet amusement. Some guards smirked, others shook their heads, but none interfered. They seemed almost proud of the bewilderment they caused, as though the soft power of sugar and fizz could do more than barbed wire ever could. Hans, however, felt something deeper stirring. Each sip of Coca-Cola, each spoonful of ice cream, tore at the foundation of what he had been taught. The Reich had painted America as a land of greed, chaos, and weakness. Yet here was proof of a different reality, a land so wealthy it could spare luxuries even for its enemies. More than that, the very act of sharing such things with prisoners carried a strange message. It was not hatred, not cruelty. It was, in its own way, a gesture of humanity. Lying in his bunk one evening, Hans turned the empty Coca-Cola bottle in his hands. The glass caught the light of the fading sun, glowing faintly amber. He wondered about the workers who had filled it, the factories that produced it, the children who drank it freely without knowing what war meant. He imagined a country where ice cream was not a miracle, but an everyday thing, where a boy could grow up never knowing the taste of hunger. That thought gnawed at him. If such a world existed, then what had all the sacrifice been for? What had all the marches, the battles, the suffering of his people achieved if the enemy lived in such abundance while Germany withered under bombs? At night, the men began to whisper about their captors in new tones. They no longer spoke of escape or of glory awaiting them back home. Instead, they asked questions. Could America truly be like this everywhere? Did children here really drink Coca-Cola daily? Did families sit together eating ice cream in summer without fear of sirens and bombs? Hans listened to these whispers and felt the weight of them. He did not know if he envied the Americans or resented them. Perhaps both. But one thing was certain. The sweetness of ice cream and the fizz of Coca-Cola had shaken him more deeply than any gunfire. For in those simple tastes, he had glimpsed not just comfort, but a life he had never imagined possible. And once imagined, it could never be forgotten. As the weeks turned into months, the camp settled into a rhythm that was almost mundane. But for Hans and the other prisoners, it was a strange, new kind of life. The initial shock of American abundance had worn off, replaced by a quiet curiosity, and for some, even enjoyment. They rose early to the sound of the guards' whistles, lined up for roll call, and then went about their assigned duties. But outside the labor and routines, something unexpected began to grow. Human connections that defied the barriers of language, nationality, and war. At first, these bonds were tentative. The Germans were cautious around the Americans, unsure whether the small acts of kindness, the hot meals, the clean barracks, the occasional laughter, were genuine or traps. Hans observed the guards from afar, noting the differences in their demeanor. Some were strict but fair, while others smiled easily, teasing the prisoners gently. It was confusing. In Germany, the enemy was meant to be feared, hated, annihilated. Here the lines were blurred. Communication was halting at best. Hans knew some English words: food, water, work, and a few guards knew German. But gestures, facial expressions, and shared experiences became their language. One day, while repairing a fence near the edge of the camp, Hans and a young American soldier named Tom began to talk through broken sentences, pointing to tools, miming actions, and laughing when mistakes were made. By the end of the day, Hans had learned Tom's favorite baseball team, and Tom knew Hans loved to fish back home. Simple knowledge, but it carried a strange weight. They were men, not enemies in that moment. The canteen continued to astonish. Ice cream and Coca-Cola became daily treats, symbols not only of comfort but of the alien world they now inhabited. Prisoners would sit in the sun with their cold cups and cones, comparing flavors and debating which was superior. Some joked that America was a land ruled by sugar and bubbles. Others marveled at the efficiency that allowed such luxuries to exist even in wartime. Hans found himself smiling more often than he had in years, laughing at the ridiculous arguments over chocolate versus vanilla, cola versus root beer. Cultural differences sparked fascination as well. One afternoon, Hans watched a group of Americans play a game he had never seen. Baseball with its curious rules, the rapid clatter of the bat hitting the ball, the cheering. He and a few others were invited to try, awkwardly swinging at the ball and stumbling over bases. But the Americans encouraged them, laughed with them, and clapped at their clumsy attempts. It was a small gesture, but it carried meaning. Here, the enemy could be playful, generous, and even kind. Yet confusion persisted. At night, Hans and the others would talk quietly in the barracks. "How can they be our enemies and yet treat us like this?" One man asked, shaking his head. "Are we the fools?" Another replied, "No, perhaps we were the fools all along, believing everything we were told." The discussion spiraled into debates about morality, propaganda, and truth. Hans remained silent for long stretches, lost in thought. He did not have answers. He only knew that the ice cream and cola had revealed a paradox. The enemy could be humane, and humanity could exist even amidst war. Friendships among the prisoners also grew stronger. Shared labor, long meals, and the absurdity of arguing over sweet treats created camaraderie. Men who had never spoken were now inseparable, helping one another with chores, sharing stories of home, and teaching each other small skills: how to mend boots, how to preserve scraps of food, how to find comfort in a place meant for confinement. Even the guards sometimes joined in conversations, correcting pronunciations or offering tips for better scooping of ice cream, blurring the lines further. Hans found himself thinking about home more often. The world he had left behind seemed smaller, darker, harsher in comparison to the openness of this camp. Yet he also realized that no matter how humane the Americans were, the war still loomed beyond the fences. Letters from family were slow, reports from Germany were scarce, and the conflict continued to rage in cities far away. He felt torn between gratitude for this strange mercy and guilt for surviving while others suffered. But the most profound change came quietly. Hans began to understand the Americans, not as abstractions, not as enemies in propaganda films, but as humans with lives, joys, fears, and dreams. The ice cream and Coca-Cola had merely been the gateway, the first hint that the world could be larger, kinder, and more complex than he had ever imagined. Behind the fences, between the barracks and mess halls, a subtle revolution of thought was taking place. Hatred softened, curiosity grew, and the prisoners began to see that humanity was not limited by nationality, uniform, or ideology. Evenings were the hardest. When the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched long across the camp, and Hans would lie on his bunk staring at the ceiling. He thought of his father's farm, his mother's hands kneading dough, his younger brother running through fields. He thought of friends who had fallen in battle, cities reduced to rubble, and neighbors who no longer greeted each other with smiles. And yet he also thought of ice cream, the fizz of cola, the laughter of Americans and Germans mingling in a strange harmony. It was a lesson in contradiction. He did not yet understand how this life fit into the larger war, how sugar and kindness could coexist with bullets and bombs. But he felt it in his chest, a quiet, growing realization that the enemy he had feared was more like him than he had ever dared imagine. And that thought, fragile as it was, became a seed of hope, a promise that perhaps, when the war finally ended, the world could be something better. The seasons changed, and with each passing month, Hans felt a strange duality growing inside him. He was still a prisoner, still a soldier from a defeated army, but he was also a witness to a world he had never imagined. The camp had become a place of paradox. Fences and watchtowers framed a life of unexpected abundance, and captors acted with decency even when the war demanded cruelty. The taste of ice cream and Coca-Cola, simple pleasures he had once thought frivolous, had opened his eyes to a humanity he had long forgotten. Letters from home arrived sporadically, each one a mixture of relief and dread. The news was grim. Cities leveled, families scattered, and Germany's infrastructure crumbling under relentless bombing. Hans read each letter carefully, clutching them like fragile lifelines, but also feeling a pang of guilt. He had food, warmth, and even small comforts that many back home could not imagine. The war had robbed his countrymen of so much, yet here he was, living behind fences that shielded him from its worst horrors. One quiet evening, Hans walked to the edge of the camp, where the sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. He watched the Americans tending the fields beyond the wire, children playing in distant towns, and the guards returning to their barracks with laughter in their voices. Everything seemed orderly, peaceful, almost ordinary. And yet, he could not forget the bloodshed, the loss, the pain. War was still out there, relentless and unforgiving. But inside this camp, he had seen another possibility, a world where human decency survived, even flourished, amid chaos. The ice cream and Coca-Cola had become more than treats. They were symbols of something deeper. Each cup and bottle represented a small act of care, a gesture that defied hatred. Hans remembered the first time he tasted them, how disbelief had turned into joy, and then into reflection. They had sparked conversations, arguments, laughter, and even friendship. The prisoners had learned that survival was not merely about enduring hunger or fear. It was also about recognizing life's small miracles, even when surrounded by uncertainty. Friendships, forged behind barbed wire, grew stronger. Hans found himself helping younger soldiers with chores, sharing stories of home, and even teaching English words he had picked up. In return, he learned about American families, baseball, holidays, and traditions. These exchanges, while simple, on the surface, carried profound meaning. They blurred the line between enemy and human, between captive and captor, between fear and understanding. Hans often thought about the propaganda he had believed. The lessons drilled into him about the inferiority and decadence of the Americans. He realized now how incomplete, how deliberately distorted those lessons had been. The enemy was not a faceless evil to be destroyed. They were people, flawed and complex, capable of both kindness and cruelty. And in that realization, he felt a mixture of humility and hope. If humans could surprise him so profoundly here, what might the future hold for the world beyond these fences? Even as the war continued, Hans's perspective shifted. He no longer measured life solely in victories or losses, battles won or comrades fallen. He measured it in moments. The first sip of cola, the creamy sweetness of ice cream, the laughter shared over a baseball game, the warmth of a blanket on a cold night. These were the moments that reminded him of what was worth protecting, not just for Germany, but for humanity itself. When news came that the war in Europe was drawing to a close, the camp buzzed with excitement and uncertainty. The prisoners would soon be allowed to return home, but Hans understood that home would not be the same. Germany had changed, he had changed, and the memories of kindness, abundance, and simple pleasures in an enemy camp would linger long after he crossed the border. He would remember how ice cream had once seemed like a miracle, how a bottle of Coca-Cola had sparked wonder, and how small acts of decency could shake the foundations of hatred. On his last night in the camp, Hans stood beneath the stars, listening to the faint sounds of laughter, the distant hum of activity, and the gentle whispers of men preparing to leave. He felt gratitude, sorrow, and hope all at once. War had taken much from him, but it had also given him lessons he would carry forever. That humanity could survive even in captivity, that kindness could pierce the darkest of times, and that the world, despite its chaos, held moments of sweetness and wonder worth remembering. As he boarded the train back to a country scarred by conflict, Hans clutched a small memento, a glass Coca-Cola bottle he had saved, empty but intact. It was more than glass. It was a symbol of perspective, of the humanity he had found in the most unlikely of places. And as the train rolled forward, carrying him toward uncertainty, he smiled faintly, knowing that sometimes, even in the midst of war, the simplest pleasures could teach the deepest lessons. Hans Bauer, a soldier once hardened by the front lines, now carried with him a fragile, enduring truth. Even in the heart of conflict, the world could surprise you with mercy, joy, and the sweetness of life.